For 6 decades, Françafrique has cast a long shadow over Africa's political and economic landscape, a web of influence that has bound former French colonies to Paris through political patronage, military interventions and economic control. While France has repeatedly claimed to turn the page on this era, the reality suggests otherwise as far as the African continent is concerned. From covert political dealings to economic dependencies and military entanglements, the mechanisms of Françafrique remain deeply entrenched vis-à-vis Africa. But recent years have seen growing resistance across West and Central Africa. Citizens and governments alike are challenging France's hold, demanding true sovereignty, like is the case in West Africa and other parts of the African continent, expelling French troops and cutting economic ties. So is this the final unraveling of Françafrique and Africa, or will it find new ways to reinvent itself? Today on Talking Points, we'll ask, will it truly take, or what it would truly take to dismantle Françafrique once and for all? And what could a post-Françafrique looks like on the African continent? Ladies and gentlemen, join us as we explore this with our guest this day. This is Talking Points. Stay with us. Hello Africa and the world, thank you immensely for joining us on your Pan-African television on this edition of Talking Point, where we discuss African matters and beyond. And this day we're talking about Françafrique. Like I mentioned in the preamble, it's been over 60 years since the term emanated on the African continent, while African countries are struggling to gain true independence, true liberation from this phenomenon that has been plaguing the African continent. Is worth noting that is still very much present in this new colonial era. Of course, to evoke this very pertinent topic, we'll be discussing this with our guest this day. And to welcome all the way from Tunisia this afternoon, we're being joined by IMED KRAYEM, who is an ambassador for sustainability for the world of global sustainability, and equally doubles as the representative or manager for Africa Diplomatic Link in Tunisia. You're welcome on board.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this warm welcome. I'm very, very excited
if you can
to be
hear
here
us,
with
please,
you.
can you unmute your mic so we can be able to hear you?
Okay.
All right. Equally, we have been joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist, an economist, and the CEO of FINTECH. Thank you, Master, sir, for honoring our invitation.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me, and thank my co-partners for joining us as well. I hope we have a very fruitful conversation today.
Indeed, we look forward to fruitful conversations like every other day. Of course, these are matters that will reshape the narrative across the African continent. And to debut to this conversation, I'd like to kickstart with you, IMED. Now, what, in your perspective, what are some of the key pillars, of Françafrique that are very much eminent or evident in today's world, present-day Africa, this part, the evolution over the past decades?
Yes, I think this phenomenon is start to be really on ground. Many countries start to be away from this culture or this Francophonie in France. Many countries, we can see Nigeria in the Western Africa, start to make actions on ground. In the past, there is others like Rwanda that makes steps. I think now it's time to change. It's time to be away from this culture, because for more than 60 years now, from the independence, from the 16th, we didn't win anything from this appartenance to this community. I think now we need to think for another way, another system, another strategy to develop or to make boost for Africa.
To what extent has Françafrique on the African continent, continued the legacy, or better still, which it had in the past, in this present day Africa which we're seeing as of now?
You know, this term is operated first time in the 19th century by the French geography Onisine Rago. It was something that reoperated after in the 16th when African countries get their independence. And it was built by three major leaders in Africa, Léopold Senghor from Senegal, Bourguiba from Tunisia, and from Nigeria, the leader was, I think, from Nigeria, the leader at that time. So now we have about 56 countries that are under this, like Commonwealth or Union. But really, many of these countries are not satisfied, and they want to go away from this union and to make another way. So I think here in Tunisia, for example, to be part of this French Union or Francophone Union is something that stopped our development, our economy for many decades. That's why young generation and politicals, even in education now, they start to introduce like other system to open bridge, a new bridge. I think it's time. Thank you.
Matt, now, proceeding with you, Dr. FONGOD, in your perspective, you have listened to your co-panelists, IMED KRAYEM. Now, do you believe that Françafrique, as of now, is like a continuation of the French colonial rule which we experienced over 60 years ago on the African continent?
Yes, of course.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, of course. That's why France militate to maintain this union. And you know, in last year, for example, when three countries like Niger, like Burkina Faso, and Mali start to go away, it was like a war with France. That's why I think France has all benefits from this union, but the other African country, there is no benefits from this union. It's like a colonization, and we need to stop this colonization now, right now.
Indeed, the new colonial era needs to come to an end for Africa to have its true liberation. But then that question was actually directed for Dr. Stanley FONGOD. If he's with us, can you proceed, Dr. FONGOD?
Yes, I think that we have come of age, especially on the African continent, and the reason for that is because France in itself, after being a great benefactor of the transatlantic slave trade, and once that ended, which basically brought great development to France, it decided to basically come into Africa, which was quite, a very monumental task that it took to be able to enslave, the continent again, especially 29 countries on the continent of Africa through, the colonial era. There are 29 countries on the continent of Africa that are French-speaking, and those are the footprints of France on the African continent, and 21 of those countries are part of the Françafrique, which has been an arm, of the post-slavery and also new colonialism by France on the continent of Africa. France has been a brutal taskmaster on the continent of Africa. I don't think that there's any other European country that can match the intensity that France has been able to push on the African continent in terms of accuracy, in terms of our just pure shell inhumane treatments of Africans, brutal treatment of Africans, in pursuit of raw materials out of the continent of Africa. If you really want to understand the state of how France has operated on the continent of Africa, you need to look at the emancipation that came as a result of that would have been the great leader of the country of Mali, who basically said that there was no way in which they were going to allow Franks to have any kind of influence, on the African continent. And as a result of that, there was a brutal uprising of which Franks basically massacred, killed a lot of people in those uprisings. This is also in Madagascar. This is also in places like Cameroon. This is also in places like the DRC. You can just go, Central African Republic rather. You can name, like country after country after country after country on the continent of Africa, and see to see how France brutally, massacred a lot of people on the continent of Africa just to protect its status and to protect its influence on the continent. So when we talk about Africa basically being emancipated within the framework of where we stand in this 21st century, it is nothing else but long overdue. And I think that there is absolutely no conversation whether we should be delivered, whether Africans or Franco-Africans should move away from France. The question is, what will be the repercussions or what will be the consequences, that France has to face as a result of this brutal regime on the continent of Africa. It's quite sickening to know that there are still skulls of Africans, human heads of Africans, our leaders, that are still stocked up in in France to today, and has not yet been returned on the continent of Africa, which was taken as a booty of war. That in itself is very sad.
FONGOD, and now you mentioned that there were some colonial atrocities that were committed in several African nations, but then France is still very much present. They have been implicating or taking parts in numerous political, economic, as well as educational systems across different African countries. With that said, do you believe that French or France's political ties, they cut across and have influence in one way or the other and continue to influence governance, democracy, stability in all African countries or most African countries? And how is, or what is the way out, like breaking the chain, like what we're seeing now in West Africa, notably in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger?
I don't think that France has anything to offer so far as the of Africa is concerned. If you look at what happened in 1958 with Ahmed Toure, who was the president then of Guinea, when Guinea decided that it was going to walk away from, after basically, going in through entire referendum that basically stated that they needed full independence from France. France basically made a statement on the continent of Africa that told the rest of, the Francophonie countries that if they were going to follow the path of Guinea, it was going to be a bloodbath. After a huge fight, all they did was sabotage all French colonial structures in Guinea. We're talking about buildings, farms, in machines. They just poured sand, concrete, on pipes, rendered them absolutely useless, pour concrete in engines of vehicles, rendered them useless. They left Guinea, in nothing else but the wasteland. That was the colonial, legacy of a man like Charles de Gaulle. And this was underneath the French president, Charles de Gaulle. Each time I have to fly through Paris, and I have to transit through Paris, and I'm at this airport called Charles de Gaulle, it's a reminder of the legacy of French colonial rule on the continent of Africa. These are very evil men. And the reality is this, that there is nothing about democracy that France is basically or should lecture the continent of Africa for. Most of the presidents we have had on the continent of Africa within the Francophonie zone has been people who have been installed as puppets by France to continue their legacy on the continent of Africa. So the notion of democracy is not something that should come out of the mouth of France. France has no moral grounds to be able to talk to the African or lecture the African on democracy, or anybody else for that matter. Frankly speaking, if I was going to be in their shoes, I should be quiet, because once you have killed people, like the former president president of Central African Republic who died in an explosion in a plane, all right, and which the French media basically buried that. It was many, many years later that the truth came out. You're looking at a place like Madagascar, where the Madagascans, these were people who carried out one of the 1954, one of the worst uprising that took place in Madagascar, and French military soldiers took prisoners on plane, and then as they were flying 30,000 feet above sea level, they pushed them out of the plane to their deaths. These are not men, these are very evil men, and there's no reason why the Africans should forget their legacy.
Thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. Now, moving back to you, IMED, you listen to your co-panelists, and of course, like we discussed in this very important topic, from your perspective, what role has France played, as you know, cited Dr. Stanley FONGOD, in the regime changes that we've seen across the African continent, both through support as well as through interference in African countries?
Yes, I agree with the doctor about what he said about France and the interference in African regimes. Really, France did everything and still doing everything to maintain its position here in Africa, even changing president, changing regimes, making uprising, making conflict, civil wars, everything. The final issue is to have the hand on Africa. That's why now we need to be unified, because in the past, many countries like Guinea, like others, try to work away from this colonization or new colonization, but they face a lot of problems because
connect with you properly, but then back to you, Dr. FONGOD. Like I was asking your co-panelists, what roles have France played in regime changes, both at the level of support and at the level of interference as far as African countries is concerned?
I don't think that this...
Okay.
I don't think that there's any country on the African continent that we can be, especially in most of those countries that was basically, ruled by France. There's none of those countries that we can be able to sit on the sidelines and say France did nothing. It's not in Mali, it's not in Niger, it's not in Cameroon, it's not in Central African Republic, it's not in Madagascar. You just go on and on. Look at the Sahel. Look at what is happening within the Sahel. The reality is this, that the brutal oppression of France on the continent of Africa has been well documented. Is it in assassinations of leaders who basically was going in a different direction, and France wanted to be able to state that they had to go in another direction? It was when explosive, devices were found in train stations in Paris that France basically took its hands off of Algeria. Algeria went through a brutal period, trying to be able to get independence from France for over half a century. And so the reality is this, that there has to be a lot of talk pertaining to France's atrocities on the continent of Africa. And one of the saddest thing is this: there's something called the Stockholm syndrome. The Stockholm syndrome is when you have somebody who basically captures an individual, and then the captor, the person who is being captured by this particular person, falls in love with whoever captures them. All right, and so they basically feel sympathy for them and feel that they had every kind of right to do exactly what they did. The truth of the matter is this: that Africa, in most French African countries, we are suffering from this Stockholm syndrome, and this is the brutal reality of Africans. And that is why when there is some mass shooting that takes place somewhere, or an attack that takes place somewhere in France, the Africans are very quick to send their condolences. We are very quick to be able to say, we stand with Paris, we stand with God knows what. But the atrocities that are carried on the continent of Africa daily, inspired, controlled, launched, manipulated, and paid for by France, nobody is saying anything about it. If you look at just look at Central African Republic today, look recently as what has been happening in places like Mali, look at what has happened in places like Niger, look at what has happened in places like Burkina Faso. all you see is the legacy of the atrocity of Franks on the continent of Africa. And what we should do, so far as I'm concerned, is not ask ourselves if we should be able to depart, from Franks and basically allow Franks to have no foothold on the continent of Africa. There are steps we should do for that, but I think that for the emancipation of Africa, for the salvation of our minds, and for the dignity of and the sovereignty of the continent, there is no way we can be able to write the history of Africa in the 21st century and be able to have Franks participate in any form on the continent of Africa, not in trade, not in diplomacy. We need to be able to define trade, define diplomacy, define everything according to what the African wants, and the history of the African must be written by the Africans, and we must do whatever it takes collectively from the north to the south, to the east and to the west. We must work together as a bloc to be able to define our story going forward. And France, for the love of God, cannot be part of that story.
You said, Franks cannot be part of the African story. We should reiterate that these tensions has been growing between Algeria, for instance, and Franks in recent years with, the Algerian parliament calling on Franks to pay reparations to the nation. But away from that, IMED, do you believe that it's possible to actually scrap up Franks entirely from the African continent? And what, in your opinion, is needed to completely eradicate this phenomenon of Françafrique within the continent of Africa?
Yes, it can be done, of course, but I like it the term of the Dr. Stockholm syndrome. Really, we have the Stockholm syndrome toward France. Many people or many regime or even population are resistant to change because they have like a feeling toward France. Perhaps, like Dr. said, it's like Stockholm syndrome. Now we need to start to change the mindset that with France we can't gain anything. We don't win anything in the past and in the future too. So that's why now we start to make blocks. We need to have blocks together so we can deal with other part of the world, other countries like Russia now, China, everyone, because really, I can give the example in Tunisia, for example, even to have cars or to buy cars or to bring cars from outside, we are obliged to have French cars. And it's something bad. For example, if we want to have cheaper cars from Asia, it's not easy for us. For example, we need to deal with French market and French cars market. Now, as Dr. said, we need to have blocks. We need to be united to change the mentality, the mindset, this syndrome, this Stockholm syndrome, this affinity toward France, and after that, go away for other markets, for other alliance partnership with new countries or new region on the world.
Exactly, you said it's all about a change of mindset. Dr. Fongod, on numerous occasions on this platform, we have reiterated indeed that Africans need to, have a change of mindset to advance the continent. Adding up to what your co-panelists said, do you share the same opinion? And of course, how can Africans proceed, especially at the level of, the stakeholders that are at the very heart of making changes within the continent of Africa, go about this issue of change of mindset, which we have reiterated on numerous occasions?
I think that the first thing we need to do on the continent of Africa is basically work on our language. And I think that language basically builds culture. Language says a lot about who we are, and the sentiments we derive when we speak basically, informs our philosophy. So we need to be able to work on our language. And I will propose that, to be fair, on the continent of Africa, we need to be able to use a language like Swahili, which basically carries, I think, 40% of 40 or 60% of Swahili is actually Arabic. And I think that it basically takes care of most of those in the north and then takes care of those who are in the south as well. So East Africa probably might be the place where we go to have a continental language that will be good for all Africans and Africans of all peoples. So that it will be something that we basically go to. Secondly, we must make sure that the 14 countries on the African continent that is still stuck across the world, and I think that we must be able to learn leverage that and bring those skill sets back on the continent of Africa as we emerge and as we move away from this colonial oppressions, post-colonial oppressions that is still taking place, on the continent, neo-colonialism that is still taking place on the continent of Africa. If you look at a place like Niger, whoever knew that the uranium being mined in Niger, francs was paying penny on the dollar, and if you look at, and yet francs was basically selling, still is selling electricity across Europe from uranium mined in Niger, and they were paying pennies to a dollar. A kilo of uranium was about 70-something cents. Meanwhile, it was almost $200 to $300 in the world market. After the fall of Bazoum, and yet before the fall of Bazoum, a country like Niger basically was at the bottom of all human economic indexes. But now, Niger is actually, of 2024, 2025, 2023, 2024, projected 7th fastest growing economy in the world, and in Africa, the fastest growing economy. That tells you exactly a difference a year can make. That just out of a sudden, because of a change in leadership, Africa began to emerge. I think that's our story.
The African continent, and we have conversations like this in a bit to change the narrative across Africa. Meanwhile, IMED, before I'll be coming back to you, Dr. FONGOD, to evoke the economic aspect of these phenomenon on the African continent impeding development. But then, IMED, I'll have you looking at the changes, the sweeping changes we have seen in West Africa, notably in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, of solidification to ensure that things run smoothly so the continent can be united. Now, Dr. FONGOD, earlier on, you were stating that it's imperative for African nations to have different currencies within their regional blocks, for them to be able to trade amongst themselves and create some sort of a solid ground, a solid foundation that puts the African continent in a very positive spot when it comes to global partnerships. But then, on numerous occasions, pundits have shared the opinion that Africa needs to change, especially the 14 countries on the African continent that are still using the franc CFA. They have to change this currency. You're an economist. How has franc CFA, from your perspective, contributed to economic dependency on the African continent? Or more like it, what are the challenges of moving away from it? And if Africa, say Africa is moving away from this currency, what would be the best alternative?
Well, I've always thought that we need to have a currency on the continent of Africa, which is going to be a continental currency, where every country on the continent of Africa will be able to use. For us to achieve that monumental feat, we need to be able to make sure that we mirror image each other in terms of our in terms of our monetary and fiscal policies. There has to be a way in which they mirror each other. Otherwise, one country would drive one country's economy would drive another country's economy down because of the way their policies are set up. So there has to be one blanketed policy across the continent, at least in many factors, so that we can be able to maintain that super currency. What I think is that for us to be able to achieve something like that, which might be extremely quite difficult, and the reason for that is because of the complex nature of the continent of Africa and the way we are structured, we might be able to have currencies that operate in zones, and then use that as a template to figure out how we can be able to scale. Because if we're able to understand a particular currency's behavior over something like the CFA, over something like the Naira in Nigeria, over something like the CDs in Ghana, if we're able to understand exactly its behavior and what will be the policies that will influence it, we can use that as a template to now be able to scale and then have many more countries come underneath that. But I think that over time, we can basically operate the way the euro actually does, which is basically this super currency that operates over all the local currencies, the Swiss francs, the French francs, that operates, the British pounds, or that operates over those currencies that are in Europe. I think that that is what we need on the continent of Africa, and that will be the way that pushes us forward and to bring us into a place where we can fully be able to understand and leverage what we have. We can no longer allow 14 African countries to continue to be subservient to France and whatever France wants to do, because then obviously currency manipulation, it's always something that France has done. And so that simply means if France is basically buying, from Africa, they have this, and especially from those 14 different African countries, they will manipulate the currency, all right? It is, to benefit what they're doing, so they can devalue a currency just so that they can be able to have, larger exports out of the continent of Africa, at cheaper prices. And that is something that you cannot allow to happen. But unfortunately, that has been the mode of operation on the continent of Africa. And frankly speaking, I think that every young African who is on the continent of Africa understands, this play, they understand these, tactics that France is using, and they're just tired of it.
Which is, I don't forget the question I intend to ask you, Dr. FONGOD. You said it's imperative for Africa to be able to have its own currency. But then, do you think that this relation that Africa has with France of not being able to change the franc CFA up to now, like we mentioned, we have 14 countries on the African continent that are using this currency. Up to date, we've had numerous calls by numerous economists on the African continent and beyond for Africa to be able to change its currency. Do you believe that up to date, if we haven't moved past this economic bondage, is due to the fact that there is some sort of lack of political will, or does not change of mindset, like your co-panelist was stating earlier on?
Well, the reason is because if you think that France is operating only in France, France is implanted like a demon in the minds and in the hearts of many African leaders, all right? So when you see an African leader, especially those who are in love with France, you are actually seeing France. Same mindset, same ideas, same culture. They treat Paris like Mecca, all right, or Jerusalem if you're a Christian. They basically adore every single thing that there is about Paris. And so the moment you basically start talking about how we have to move away from this, they have the tendency to pause because they're thinking about their relationships in France. They have the tendency to think a little bit deeper, or this is what we should do, this is how we should do. Who cares? We're talking about the salvation of the continent. We are talking about, us basically having the dignity that it entails as Africans to be able to charter our own course and to charter our own future, a future that Africans will be proud of, a future that our ancestors, basically fought for. The reality is this, that the salvation of the continent will not be offshore, it will be onshore. It's not going to come from outside of the continent of America. I don't care if it's the United States of America. I do not care if it's France. I don't care who is coming. I don't care if it's Russia. I don't care if it's China. The reality is this, that the African must look at the mirror and fully understand that what he sees in the mirror is what the continent of Africa has been waiting for. We are the ones we have been waiting for. Nobody is coming from anywhere else for the emancipation of the continent of Africa. And I think that the question that we need to be asking is, how many Pan-Africans do we have on the continent of Africa that will stand to fight for Africa? How many Pan-Africans do we have on the continent of Africa that will stand to speak for Africa, that will have to do what it takes to deliver the continent? If we are talking about the leadership that we have had for the last 60 years, for the last 6 decades, for the last 4 decades, for the last 5 decades on the continent of Africa, this man has been puppet of Paris. This man has been puppets of the regime. Whatever regime that Paris has had, this man has been puppets, of those regime. So we need to be able to fully understand that we cannot rely on people like that. There has to be fresh blood, new ideas, new mindset for with the leadership that we have emerging on the continent of Africa, that will have to be able to deliver the continent, deliver these nations from the oppression that has come as a result of France. Maybe if we really are serious about things, we need to look to the Sahel. We need to look to Burkina Faso. We need to look to Mali. We need to look to Niger, because for some strange reason, those boys in the Sahel seems to know exactly what they want, and they're doing whatever it takes to make sure that they prove that this is what it takes for Africa to be liberated from the oppressions of France. And frankly speaking, I have no problem with those boys in the Sahel.
Immense. Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD. Now back to you, IMED. Earlier on, you were citing partnerships on the African continent, and of course, Africans having partners, relations with the rest of the world. Now, I'd like to pick up from that line. Having listened to your co-panelists, do you believe, or do you share the opinion that engaging relations with other external institutions, or better still, other global powers, will set the African continent in another different bondage of what we're going to term neocolonialism in this era? Because at this point, your co-panelist was stating that France is like it's rooted on the African continent. Wouldn't Africa having different partnerships look like a second colonization of the African continent?
Yes, I totally agree, because now, for especially all the leaders in Africa, they have a strong link with France. And as my colleague said, they are moving to Paris like going to Jerusalem.
Well, unfortunately, we lost you, IMED, KRAYEM. Hopefully, due to some network disturbances, we're unable to fully communicate with you, but then hopefully you get back to us like you have been contributing in the course of today's edition. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point on 4U Media Africa, your Pan-African channel. Today we're discussing 60 years after Françafrique within the continent of Africa, trying to see how Africa can detach itself from this phenomenon, this cankerworm that has been deeply rooted on the African continent. Dr. FONGOD, I was asking your co-panelists about partnerships Africa has with the rest of the world, asking if these partnerships in one way or the other could be a second way of colonization, a second attempt to colonize the African continent, or better still, other forms of soft power within Africa.
Of soft power, to me, is very interesting, and I think that we need to be extremely very careful, because when we start talking about soft power, there's no difference between soft power and the colonial era. There is no difference between soft power and slavery, or at least the consequences of slavery. In more ways, slavery basically meant exporting young Africans out of the continent of Africa, but the reality is that soft power is equally as dangerous as anything else, and we need to fully understand this. And so when we talk about soft power, we have to be extremely very careful. I think, in all honesty, that whether it's coming from the United States of America, or it's coming from the boys in Europe, or it's coming from anywhere around the world, there has to be a way in which we have to become self-reliant on the continent of Africa. We have to produce what we eat. We have to farm what we eat. We have to manufacture what we use. We need to be able to find ways in which we improve industrialization on the continent of Africa, and that will come as a result of us having this self-will, self-determination to do what we need to do so far as our lives are concerned. The fact that we have to constantly depend either France, either England, either Germany, either the United States, China, or the guys in the Eastern Bloc, that does not matter. We need to find ways in which we can accomplish this, a humongous task of bringing manufacturing on the continent of Africa, bringing industrialization on the continent of Africa, converting our raw materials into, at least semi to semi-finished goods, finding ways in which we can improve, on trade, where we actually export not raw materials out of the continent of Africa, but we find ways to export semi to semi-finished goods outside of the continent of Africa. I think that is something that we really need to work on. With that, which it will be extremely quite difficult, for us to start talking about how free Africa can be, from countries like France. France is just one, all right, and there are many. There's the United States, now Russia, now China is coming into the continent of Africa, and everybody is working for the interests of their countries. These are not philanthropic people. These are not men coming, like the Red Cross, coming, with boxes of medicine just to come and help. No, they're coming. Maybe they might use the Red Cross, but they are coming with caterpillars. They are coming with heavy machinery because they are interested in mining. They are interested in looting the continent for the raw materials that she has. So whenever you see a bag of rice, just know that a kilo of gold has left your country.
Now, Dr. FONGOD, you mentioned that Africa needs to stand up itself in the wake of all these, attempts to take control of the African continent. But then, being an economist, we are well aware that there's numerous economic mechanisms that are being used to gain grounds on the African continent. Let's go naming trade agreements, corporate dominance, aid structures that are very much present on the African continent. Looking at aid, for instance, do you think all these aspects, all these economic mechanisms are some of the ways through which it keeps the Françafrique very much alive on the African continent?
No, I don't think that there's anything. There are no trade agreements. There is absolutely nothing that France has done, or nothing that any other Western power or Eastern guys from the Eastern Bloc has done on the continent of Africa has basically stifled the Africans in terms of development, in terms of our own economic issues. I don't think that we have suffered in any way from what France has done or any of that garbage. The reason why I said that is because the continuous oppression of a particular person is dependent on the tolerance level of that individual. As long as we continue to tolerate what France is doing, to tolerate all of this stuff, we can talk about economic policies all we want. We can talk about the financial monetary policies all we want. We can talk about all of things all we want. Bottom line is this: the day a man changes is the day the man says enough is enough. It's the day in which somebody rises up and said, I'm not going to take this garbage anymore. It's the day somebody basically says, this is how far you come and you cannot come any further. It's the day an individual basically states that it is okay that you deceived my fathers, you did that to my forefathers, but I am a new breed, and today you will not do that. The day Africa emerges is the day we have the psychologists of those boys in the Sahel, which basically states that, you know what, we might be 20-something years old, we don't give a damn, we don't care, we are going to make sure that we take, our story going forward into our own hands. Our destiny will have to be in our hands. We are not going to allow our destiny in a puppet, in a man who is being controlled and ruled, by somebody who is sitting, a 45-year-old sitting somewhere in Paris and basically calling shots around. They said, no, that's not what we're looking for. And I think that is where Africa basically needs to emerge. We cannot continually end on this expedition, which we have been having, talking about, the different economic issues, the different political issues, and all of yes, of course, this happened. We've seen it happen. We know it's happening. We are absolutely, knowledgeable about what France has done on the continent of Africa. What I'm interested in knowing is, what are we going to do about it? And that is the question.
Indeed, that is the question Africans have to answer. I'll be coming back to you if you pick up from where you stopped, Dr. FONGOD. But IMED, if you're with us, in your perspective, what's needed for Africa to gain true independence?
Just I have a remark concerning what we said. I think to have democracy in Africa would be the best solution. The main issue in Africa is to have democracy, and we can choose our leaders. From these leaders, we can choose the future of Africa and African country. Okay, I think we have. Okay, so if we look to the Sahel countries, for example, they are young leaders. In Niger, in Burkina Faso and Mali, they have another mentality. That's why we need to follow such kind of mentality to move away from France and other Western powers. I think if you can repeat your question, just to follow your question.
Yeah, IMED, I was asking that what's needed in your perspective for Africa. You said there is a different mentality with the leaders of the three West African countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. But I was asking, Africa, at this point, listening to your co-panelists, what's needed from your point of view for Africa to achieve true independence?
Yes, we need to achieve a new independence, because soft power, like my colleague said, is like a colonization. Because this soft power is very dangerous, because they are controlling our country, our riches, our everything, what we have here in African countries. So we need to control our riches, our strength, to move away from France and other Western colonization or Western powers. I think for the future, the best solution is to be united in blocks, because really it's not easy to be like together in the same block, because currency, like my colleague said, it's not easy to have the same currency, to have the same economy, but at least to be like the Sahel countries, block by block, small 3-4 countries together, and after that we can move for other bigger blocks.
Okay, thank you so much, IMED, for that immense contribution. Dr. FONGOD, I'll still pick up from where you stopped. You listened to your co-panelist, citing, he reiterated once again his point on having either a single currency or Africa standing block by block before thinking of going to a continental level. Now, education, language, which are key points you've mentioned in the course of this program on how Africa can emerge. Speaking of this advancement on the African continent, African nations, especially those that have cut off ties, we're looking at, we're not looking at the 3 countries in West Africa, we're looking at Chad, we're looking at Senegal. These countries, while they were sending away French troops, highlighted that they were still open for cooperation with France, in as much as they were cutting off at the security level. Now, from your perspective, having listened or followed up this latest development, can African nations achieve true, let's say, economic independence on the African continent if they are cutting away from France, yet maintaining cooperations at a regional or say partner-to-partner level? Do you think that is feasible? And in one way or the other, don't you believe that this could be impeding the progress that has been made so far by other countries within the continent of Africa in advancing this ideology of cutting away truly from France and the phenomenon of Françafrique within the continent?
Well, I don't think so. I think that Africa needs to have a lot of trading partners. The good thing about trading is that if you basically have a lot of people who you are trading with, that basically means that you have better opportunities of, getting fair value for whatever it is that the commodities that you're trading. But if you're just monolithic in your trading and you're trading under one partner, believe me, you'll be swindled. That's the reason why you need to be able to have, multiple quotes, depending on whatever stuff that you're trying to do. So as Africa has many trading partners, and let one of those trading partners be France, that's okay. We can trade with France on the basis, of fair trade. That's all right. The only thing we do not want France to do is to be on the continent of Africa telling us what we need to do, or basically telling us if they have to be our first choice in whatever minerals or stuff that we have on the continent. All of those colonial draconian stuff, nobody wants that, and we will absolutely fight that stuff to our deaths on the continent of Africa. We don't need any of that junk. The reality is this: let there be fair trade. Let us talk to America. All right. The notion that we don't have to talk to the United States is basically quite demented to me. And we cannot also just carry ourselves and locked up with the Eastern Bloc. That doesn't make any sense. We need to have everybody competing for the best commodity on the continent of Africa. And then we have to be the one who decides who we are selling to. And the reason for that is because when that becomes the mode of operation, believe me, we will have the best value. We'll sell it at the best price, that will benefit the African. And that is the way in which we grow our own economies on the continent of Africa. There are many areas on the continent of Africa that is good for agriculture. We can be able to plant different things that the West needs. We need to be able to utilize those areas. 60% of the world arable land that is good for agriculture is on the continent of Africa, which means we can supply the world all that the world needs. And unfortunately, even those of us on the continent of Africa, we can't even feed ourselves. So we need to look home, and we need to be able to make sure that if we are trading or dealing with anybody, let it be on the basis of fair trade. The notion of all these agreements and all of this stuff, frankly speaking, means nothing. The reality is this: let the African decide what the African wants to do, and believe me, if the African is tired, then the African will do something about it.
Exactly, and of course, in the multipolar world, Africans, or better still, partners, they collaborate amongst themselves, which is a common ground, which both of you have been agreeing on today. IMED, I saw you agreeing to your co-panelist or what he was stating. Do you have something to add as far as that is concerned? Do you share the same opinion?
Yes, I agree, really, because he's saying something that is real now. And for Africa, we need to have new solution. We need to move away, but we need to have another solution. And competition is something very important. We need to make many powers or many countries in competition based on fair trade, as I say, because Africa need to deal with the best solution, the best partner, the best partnership. We are not obliged, or we are not focused on only France or other country. We need to make competition between them, and from this competition we can have our benefits and deal as we want. And also there is another solution. We need to have South-South partnership. We need to deal together as African countries. Don't wait only for Southern powers or European powers. We need to have like our partnership.
Picking up from there, Dr. FONGOD, there's been this trend on the African continent, the United States of Africa, a term that has been lingering for a very long time, urging Africans, especially amongst Pan-Africanists, for Africans to unite and protect themselves from external pressures coming in on the African continent. With a term like the United States of Africa, just to borrow the ideology in the light of the spirit of Ubuntu, do you believe that Africans staying together, like the adage on the African continent goes, a united house can always stand, but a divided house will never stand? So Africa being united, is it going to go a long way in Africa, eradicating terms like this, which we have of Françafrique on the African continent, and Africa actually getting through it, true emancipation, like what you've been stating so far?
Absolutely. I think that there is also this African adage just basically speaks that if there are no enemies within, the enemies without will do us no harm.
Exactly.
And I think that the problem that Africa has is the motor that is supposed to use as the vehicle that is supposed to carry this agenda is the EU. The EU has failed. The EU, I constantly say that we need to be able to perform a funeral service for the EU. The EU is supposed to have been buried a long time ago. And the reason for that is because, of course, the OAU was the old organization, that gave birth to the EU. And the ideas was that the failures of the OAU was supposed, to be fixed with this current present EU. Unfortunately, same people, same ideas, same structure, and it hasn't done anything for the African. A lot of people get upset when I say that, but the reality is this: show me one reasonable gains that the AU has done on the continent of Africa. A united Africa is good. It's all talk. And the reason why it's all talk is because it means absolutely nothing. I think that I would rather have deeper conversations like that of Mr. Ahmed, which is having right now, which basically states that we need to find ways on the continent of Africa to improve relationships between nations to nation on the continent of Africa in trade and collaboration. If we are able to do that, that push the envelope further. We move an inch further, a centimeter further into the day where there is a united Africa. But what united Africa is there to talk about if you can't even trade a country to another country? The trading volumes between African countries are so low as opposed to their trading volumes, to European countries and American countries. That makes no sense. And you are literally a centimeter apart. There has to be infrastructures on the continent of Africa that basically links us, maybe real, super highways on the continent of Africa, super railway tracks on the continent of Africa that basically link us together so that we can be able to trade among each other. If we can open up inter-Africa trade, that would be the closest thing that we will have into a united Africa. But this united Africa, which is on paper, this talk of the united Africa is just pure talk. And it's nothing else, but one of the stupid agendas of the EU, which to me basically is meaningless. It is useless. It is a waste of time on the consciousness of the African. We need something else to replace it. But the reality is this: open up Africa, let there be inter-trade in Africa, open up these closed borders on the continent of Africa, and allow young Africans with skill sets and technology to be able to move freely within the continent of Africa and do business in Africa. That is how we bring about development for the African.
Exactly. And of course, IMED, I mentioned at the beginning of this show that you are the representative of the African Diplomatic League. Now, from your perspective, how can we use other platforms? Because your co-panelists reiterated the need that is necessary for Africa to be able to use platforms like Africans coming together, having unity amongst themselves, solidarity amongst themselves. Platforms, how can Africa use methods like diplomacy, bring in the civil society, youth activism, and even the media in ensuring that we are able to eradicate such phenomena on the African continent?
Yes, because we thought that South and South collaboration between African countries is the solution for the future. That's why we created this platform, African Diplomatic League. It's a platform for economic diplomacy, alliance, partnership between African countries, businessmen, even for education, for collaboration, everything. It's a platform that make like a link between countries and skills or skilled person from all Africa. This African Diplomatic League is like a solution for Pan-African collaboration. We think that this solution can make a difference in the future, because till now we have, for example, collaboration between businessmen from the north of Africa, from Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria. They want to invest in other countries like Senegal, like Mali, like Chad, everything. So it's like a kind of a solution to make people together, or to bring competence, to bring skills, to bring funds, and to bring partnership together. I think it's a solution for the future, and to give the ground to a skilled person in Africa, to young generation, to change the mentality, to change the way of thinking or the way of making business. That's why I invite everyone to join us in African Diplomatic League. We'll have our first conference in Dakar next month in April. It's an opportunity to change Africa, really, and to be united. As Doctor said, being united can make a difference.
Yeah, you being united makes a difference, but then Dr. FONGOD, let's just pick up from where your co-panelist stopped. He said being united makes a difference, but then looking at the points I've mentioned, youth activism, diplomacy, civil society, even the media through which we're using, because it's through the media we're having this conversation in the bid to change the narrative across Africa, are all these channels ways to which we can eradicate, Françafrique from the African continent?
Absolutely. And I think that there is something that we have not understood yet, especially about how powerful media is. There is something called the fifth generation warfare.
True.
The fifth generation warfare is a system that has been instituted, especially by the United States of America. The first time we heard about the fifth generation warfare was actually during the Arab Springs. If you look at what happened in Tunisia and all those, during the Arab Spring, the uprising, it was basically, America rolling out the fifth generational, warfare system. People who basically do not have to, basically fire a gun anywhere else, soldiers are not on ground. Let's just use social media to be able to get people to behave in a certain way. And then, folks have this tendency to not verify and they just go out and do whatever they want to do. And so we can be able to use media. We have seen recently in Kenya with the uprising that took place in Kenya, the media had a lot to do. And, and there were a lot of changes that basically took place in Kenya. I think that we need to use social media to be able to achieve a lot of things. But one thing for sure is this, for us to truly become real independent, where we can be able to have real conversations on the continent of Africa that is meaningful, we need to build our own platforms. You cannot be on these foreign platforms and think that you can be able to ignite the kind of change that is meaningful, especially if those who are in control of the platforms will not allow you to be able to do so. A few $1,000s, we can be able to build something that is really robust, something that is really powerful, that has all the securities that it takes to be able to allow young Africans to express their views, and then use that as a communication channel to see how we can be able, to basically get young people educated on the issues, because this is the first step of liberation. As long as there is no mental liberation, any physical liberation is not possible. You can restrain a man, you can tie him up, you can lock him behind bars, but as long as the man is free in his mind, he is still as dangerous as if to say he was loose. So the reality is this, that we must be able to help the African fully develop and help them come into the consciousness of their freedom, and that is the only way in which we can begin to talk about real meaningful change, which will obviously be a revolution on the continent of Africa.
We are gradually coming to the end of today's edition of Talking Points over For You Media Africa. Like you mentioned, Africans need to be trained. That's why there's been this call for, a change in the education system, a reform in the education system of Africa, for Africans to be able to have the mindset that they can champion the change that Africa requires. Now, IMED, now we're gradually coming to the end. In your words, how can Africa achieve true emancipation? Your co-panelists stated it all. But then, from your perspective, looking at it from a country-to-country perspective, we've reiterated the need for Africans to be united, Africans to stand up for themselves, to prioritize African values, and of course promote the change which they want to see and within the context of Africa. But from your perspective, how can Africa move forward with this agenda of change?
I think the first thing is being united and change the mentality and think that we can deal together and we can have gain from our partnership together. Don't think for the other powers to come and to invest in Africa. We can do business together. We can change together. Just being united, being like a block, and think and give the opportunity to young generation, especially because the mentality is changing. Young generation needs to have their chance now to make to open new opportunities and new fields for Africa. Being united and think about the future together.
Well, Africans, be united, think about the future as one people, the people which the forefathers of this great continent had actually emerged or imagined for Africa. Now, Dr. FONGOD, in your perspective, what would a free continent, free from neocolonialism, free from this issue of Françafrique actually look like when Africa is getting, through its true independence?
I think for the first time we're going to see exactly what the African is capable of. And it's not because we have not seen that before. I think if you look across the continent of Africa, and if you look at places like Mali, especially Timbuktu, if you look at places like Egypt, if you look at places like Tunisia, if you look at places like Casablanca, Morocco, if you look at places like Johannesburg, South Africa, Dar es Salaam, Cairo, all you see is Africans' ingenuity. Our abilities to be able to forge and create parts that is absolutely unmatched, anywhere around the world. The first time the first time humanity came into the consciousness of writing, it was actually in Egypt. Papyrus sheet which is used as paper. And so Africans have come a great way with great inventions. Not to talk about the great influence of Islamic scholarship that took place in places like Timbuktu, with the first university, Sankore University, in a place like Timbuktu, in many centuries ago. It's important to understand that people used to travel from all over the world to come and study in Africa, and we have to be able to embrace that. So Africa rising will not be the first time that Africa has been on top. It will be Africa re-rising again. And I think that the influence of colonial rule, France and anyone in between, has been a stain on the consciousness of the African and how great Africa can be. So far as I'm concerned, the future looks bright. I think that if you look at what has happened in the places like Sahel, it tells us that everything is possible on the continent of Africa, and that once people decide that they have come to the end of the road, that the pain and the oppression and their sheer determination for self-expression outweighs the fear of a barrel of a gun, that the sound of an AK-47 can no longer scare the African from the liberation that she deserves, then Africa truly will be safe. And in conclusion, I think that it is important for leaders in Africa to understand that they might build these high fences around their buildings and basically feel secure and feel safe. But the reality is this: you can never trust somebody who is hungry, who is desperate, and who is delusional, because he has seen that there's nothing coming their way. So for peace and for the interest of safety and security on the continent of Africa, I think that we need to start thinking about the little ones among us, those who basically have nothing, people who basically are starving. I'm talking about young people who have all the educations they can, and yet there are no jobs. We need to think about them, and think about them thoroughly. Believe me, the history of the African and the history of revolutions around the world is well catalogued. When oppression becomes the order of the day, sometimes men decide to do the unthinkable. There has to be a way in which we come together to fight this. And that, to me, will be the story of the African.
Indeed, that will be the story of the African. Africans, your destiny is in your hands. And meanwhile, I'll say thank you immensely, IMED KRAYEM, Ambassador for Global Sustainability, and equally the country manager for the African Development or African Diplomacy League. And thank you so much for your participation in today's edition of Talking Point.
Sharon, a last word, if you want. Just one. I want to invite everyone to join us on our dream for Africa, African Diplomatic League. It will be our dream for everyone, for everybody. They can join us to change Africa, to make Africa rising again.
Exactly. Africa has the opportunity to rise again. And thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD, for your immense, insightful contribution on this edition of the program. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, I was saying, it's on this note that we shall be drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Point of your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and of course, do have a great day in company of our numerous programs.